What if destroying someone's art wasn't just cruel, but a life-changing mistake? When a racist woman tears apart a young black boy's masterpiece, she thinks it's just another act of prejudice. But what she doesn't know is that the artwork she destroyed holds a secret worth millions. Stick around to see how justice unfolds in a way she never expected. It was a bright and bustling day in downtown Atlanta, and the local art fair was in full swing. Rows of vibrant stalls lined the sidewalks, each one bursting with unique pieces crafted by talented artists. Among the exhibitors was a 14-year-old boy named Jamal. A self-taught prodigy, Jamal had been sketching and painting since he could hold a pencil. His art, deeply rooted in his experiences and emotions, was unlike anything else at the fair. Jamal's booth was modest, an easel holding his most cherished painting, a vivid depiction of unity and resilience, and a small table showcasing a handful of other works. Passers-by paused, captivated by the raw emotion and storytelling woven into his art. Jamal, though shy, beamed with quiet pride as he explained the inspiration behind his creations to those who stopped to admire them. But not everyone shared the crowd's admiration. Across the street, an older woman named Margaret watched Jamal with a disdainful glare. Margaret, a regular at the art fair, prided herself on being a connoisseur of fine art, although her knowledge was limited to dated landscapes and replicas of famous pieces. She had always scoffed at modern art, especially when it came from someone she deemed unworthy of the craft. Margaret crossed the street, her heels clicking against the pavement, and approached Jamal's booth. The boy greeted her politely, his bright smile unwavering. "Good morning, ma'am. Are you interested in learning about my work?" Margaret's eyes narrowed as she scanned his paintings. "These are yours?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes, ma'am," Jamal replied. "I painted all of these. This one," he gestured toward his centerpiece, "is called Bridges of Hope. It's about overcoming barriers and finding unity." Margaret sniffed dismissively. "Overcoming barriers," she repeated mockingly. "What would a boy like you know about that?" The crowd around them grew quiet, sensing the tension. Jamal's cheeks flushed, but he kept his composure. "A lot, ma'am. Art has helped me express things I couldn't put into words." Margaret smirked and crossed her arms. "Well, let me tell you something, young man. Art is about sophistication, about refinement. Not whatever this is," she said, gesturing to his paintings with a wave of her hand. Jamal's heart sank, but before he could respond, Margaret took it a step further. With a swift motion, she grabbed the edge of his easel and toppled it over. The crowd gasped as Jamal's prized painting fell to the ground, its edges scraping against the pavement. "Oops," Margaret said coldly, her lips curling into a smirk. "Maybe next time you'll learn what real art is." Jamal knelt to pick up his painting, his hands trembling. Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them away. The crowd began murmuring, some stepping forward to help him, while others glared at Margaret in disbelief. But Jamal didn't say a word. Instead he stood, carefully dusted off his painting, and placed it back on the easel. His quiet dignity in the face of Margaret's cruelty was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. What neither Margaret nor the crowd realized was that this painting, Jamal's masterpiece, was no ordinary piece of art. It held a secret that would soon turn the tables on Margaret's smugness and reveal the incredible talent of the boy she had just tried to humiliate. As Jamal stood his painting upright once more, a man in the crowd stepped forward. He was middle-aged, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the air of someone used to making decisions that mattered. His name was Mr. Carter, a well-known art collector and philanthropist, who had been quietly observing the scene unfold from the shadows of a nearby booth. "Excuse me, young man," Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but commanding enough to hush the murmurs around them. "This piece of yours, Bridges of Hope, was it? May I take a closer look?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, unsure of the man's intentions, but then he nodded. "Of course, sir," he replied, stepping aside to let Mr. Carter view the painting. Mr. Carter studied the artwork intently, his eyes tracing every brushstroke. The crowd around them began to lean in, their curiosity piqued by his evident interest. Even Margaret, who had taken a few steps back, craned her neck to see what the fuss was about. "This is extraordinary," Mr. Carter finally said, turning to Jamal with a smile. "The depth, the emotion, the story. It's unlike anything I've seen in years. You have an incredible gift." Jamal's eyes widened in surprise, and a ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. People began whispering among themselves, reassessing the boy and his work. Margaret, however, wasn't impressed. She scoffed loudly, drawing the attention back to herself. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "You're all falling for a sob story. That painting is nothing but childish scribbles." Mr. Carter's expression darkened. "Madam," he said sharply, "I've spent decades collecting some of the finest art in the world, and I can assure you, this is no childish scribble. This is the work of a true artist." Margaret's face flushed. But before she could retort, Mr. Carter turned back to Jamal. "Young man, have you had your work appraised?" Jamal shook his head. "No, sir. I've never thought about that." Mr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Then I'd like to offer you something. Let me take this painting to an appraiser I trust. I believe you'll be surprised by its value." Jamal hesitated. The painting was deeply personal to him, a piece of his soul on canvas. But the genuine admiration in Mr. Carter's eyes gave him confidence. "All right," he said quietly. "I trust you." The crowd buzzed with anticipation as Mr. Carter carefully wrapped the painting and promised to return by the next day with the results. He shook Jamal's hand warmly. "No matter what happens," he said, "you should be proud of your talent. The world needs to see this." As Mr. Carter departed, the crowd slowly dispersed, though many stayed to browse Jamal's other pieces, now seeing them in a new light. Margaret, however, lingered at the edge of the booth, her arms crossed and her lips pursed in disdain. She refused to admit it, but something about Mr. Carter's words had shaken her confidence. What none of them knew was just how much this painting would change everything, for Jamal, for Margaret, and for everyone who had witnessed this moment. The next day arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety for Jamal. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what the appraisal might reveal. He couldn't shake the memory of Margaret's sneers or the whispers of doubt that still lingered in the crowd. Yet Mr. Carter's words had sparked a glimmer of hope in him, a belief that maybe, just maybe, his work mattered. By noon the art festival was bustling again. Jamal set up his booth as usual, though now he noticed more people stopping by, their expressions more curious than dismissive. Word had spread about the collector's interest, and Jamal's booth was becoming the unexpected centerpiece of the event. Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up near the festival's entrance, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Mr. Carter stepped out, holding Jamal's painting securely in his hands. With a confident stride, he made his way toward the young artist's booth, flanked by a man in a tailored suit carrying a clipboard. Jamal's heart raced as Mr. Carter approached. The crowd around the booth thickened, their curiosity palpable. Even Margaret, who had been trying to avoid the area, found herself unable to resist the scene unfolding before her. "Good afternoon, Jamal," Mr. Carter greeted warmly. "I have some exciting news for you." Jamal stood frozen, barely able to nod. The man with the clipboard stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter asked me to appraise this piece," he began, addressing the crowd as much as Jamal. "What I discovered was remarkable. This painting, Bridges of Hope, is not only an exceptional work of art, but also a deeply moving narrative captured with extraordinary skill." The crowd leaned in, hanging on every word. Margaret stood at the back, her arms crossed tightly, her face a mixture of annoyance and unease. "This painting," the appraiser continued, "is valued at approximately $2 million. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Jamal's eyes widened in disbelief, his knees feeling weak. 2 million? He stammered, barely able to process the number. Mr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. Yes, Jamal. Your work is extraordinary, and its value reflects that. But more than the monetary worth, it's the story and emotion in this piece that make it priceless. The crowd broke into applause, cheering for the young artist who had just shattered all their expectations. People who had previously dismissed him now clamored to see more of his work, their attitudes transformed in an instant. But Margaret wasn't clapping. Her face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at Jamal, then at the painting, her disbelief evident. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice shaky but loud enough to be heard. This can't be right. It's just a coincidence. The painting isn't worth that much. Mr. Carter turned to her, his expression calm but firm. Madam, your opinion does not change the facts. You judge this young man and his work without merit, but the world now sees what you refuse to acknowledge, his undeniable talent. Jamal, finally finding his voice, spoke up. Margaret, he said, his tone steady but kind, you taught me something important. Not everyone will believe in me, but that doesn't mean I should stop believing in myself. Thank you for that lesson. The crowd cheered again, their admiration for Jamal growing even stronger. Margaret, her face flushed with embarrassment, turned on her heel and walked away, unable to face the consequences of her actions. As Margaret disappeared into the crowd, Jamal felt a newfound strength coursing through him. For the first time in his life he stood tall, not as the boy people overlooked, but as an artist whose voice could no longer be ignored. People crowded around his booth, eager to learn more about the man behind Bridges of Hope. Jamal found himself answering questions about his inspiration, his techniques, and the struggles he had faced to get to this moment. Each story he shared drew the crowd closer to him, creating a bond that transcended the canvas. Among the admirers were several other collectors, gallery owners, and art critics. One by one they approached Jamal, offering praise and opportunities. A gallery owner from New York invited him to showcase his work in an upcoming exhibition. A renowned art critic promised to feature him in a major publication. Even a museum curator hinted at adding Bridges of Hope to their permanent collection. Jamal's dream was unfolding right before his eyes, but he didn't let the moment overwhelm him. He thanked each person graciously, keeping his humility intact. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about his talent. It was about resilience, self-belief, and the power of standing up against prejudice. As the festival wound down for the day, Mr. Carter approached Jamal again. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood an older black woman with a radiant smile and an air of authority. She extended her hand to Jamal. I'm Angela Porter, she said warmly. I run an art mentorship program for young talents like yourself. I'd be honored if you'd consider joining us. We help artists hone their craft and connect them with resources to succeed. Jamal's eyes lit up. I'd love to. Thank you so much. Angela's gaze softened. Thank you, Jamal, for reminding us all why we do this. Your story is an inspiration, and I can't wait to see what you create next. Meanwhile, Margaret sat alone at a cafe nearby, nursing a cup of coffee. The weight of the day's events pressed down on her. Her actions had not only embarrassed her but also exposed the deep-rooted biases she hadn't even realized she carried. For the first time, she questioned herself, her assumptions, her attitudes, and the choices that had led her to this moment. Her reflection was interrupted by the sound of applause in the distance. Margaret looked out the window, watching as Jamal waved to a departing crowd, his face beaming with pride. She couldn't deny the truth any longer. She had been wrong, and Jamal had proven her wrong in the most powerful way. For the first time in years, Margaret felt something stir within her. Shame, yes, but also a spark of hope. Perhaps it wasn't too late to change. As the art festival drew to a close, Jamal stood by his booth, packing up his supplies. The once distant sound of applause still echoed in his mind. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, but it ended with something he hadn't expected: validation. Mr. Carter returned once more, this time carrying a certificate. "Jamal," he said, his voice filled with admiration, "it's my honor to present you with this year's Emerging Artist Award. Your work, your resilience, and your message have touched more hearts than you can imagine." The crowd that remained erupted into cheers, clapping as Jamal accepted the certificate. His name was now etched into the history of the festival, not just as an artist, but as a symbol of courage and defiance against prejudice. In the following weeks, the opportunities Jamal received at the festival began to take shape. His work was showcased in galleries and exhibitions, his story shared on social media, and his name became synonymous with strength and creativity. Jamal's inbox was flooded with messages of encouragement from young artists, especially those who faced similar challenges. One message stood out. It was from Margaret. "I owe you an apology," it read. "I was wrong, and I see that now. Your art is extraordinary, but your courage is what truly inspires me. Thank you for opening my eyes. I hope someday I can make things right." Jamal read the message twice, then smiled. He didn't reply, at least not yet. Some lessons, he thought, required time to settle. Months later, at the opening of his first solo gallery exhibit, Jamal stood amidst his paintings, each one telling a piece of his journey. He watched as visitors wandered through the space, pausing to admire his work. Among them was Angela Porter, the mentor who had given him his first big opportunity, and Mr. Carter, the man who believed in him when few others did. At the far corner of the room, Jamal noticed a familiar face: Margaret. She stood silently, her gaze fixed on bridges of hope. For a moment, Jamal considered walking away, but something stopped him. Instead, he approached her. Margaret turned, startled to see him. "Jamal," she began, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," Jamal interrupted gently. "The fact that you're here says enough." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Jamal saw something in her that hadn't been there before: humility. As the night wore on, Jamal stepped onto the small stage at the center of the gallery. The room quieted as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "This isn't just about art. It's about what art can do, how it can challenge, heal, and bring us together. I've learned that sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with words or fists, but with creativity and resilience." The room erupted into applause, but Jamal wasn't done. He glanced at Margaret, then back at the crowd. "And I've also learned that people can change, that understanding and growth are possible if we're brave enough to face our own flaws. This exhibit isn't just my story, it's all of ours." As the night came to an end, Jamal stepped outside into the cool evening air. He looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of his journey but also the lightness of his accomplishments. His story wasn't over, it was just beginning. And he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same determination that had brought him this far. Because art wasn't just his passion, it was his purpose.